Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Hey, Crime Redefined fans, we're excited to bring you another episode. We're continuing our deep dive into the fascinating Jane Dorotik case. So before we get started, let's just remind everybody what the specs were for Jane's case. So with that said, why don't you go for it, Mehul?
Yeah, the body of Robert Dorotik was found in a wooded area in North San Diego County on Monday, February 14th of 2000. His wife, Jane Dorotik, had reported him missing the previous day when he had not returned from a jog. In June of 2001, Jane was convicted for the murder of her husband, Robert, and sentenced to 25 years to life.
In 2016, Jane finally was awarded post-conviction DNA testing on evidence in her case. It was at this time that she started working with the Loyola Project for the Innocent. Some of you might remember we previously had Paula and Adam on from LPA Crime Redefined. The results of the 2016 DNA testing were deemed not helpful at the time.
While LPI continued to work feverishly on Jane's case, she was granted a temporary release from prison due to COVID in April of 2020. Meanwhile, additional post-conviction DNA testing was performed, and LPI was developing lots of new evidence. Jane's conviction was overturned in July of 2020.
Unfortunately, Jane's ordeal was not over, however. The DA's office decided to conduct DNA testing of their own and pursue retrying Jane. After a lengthy preliminary hearing, a new trial was imminent. On the eve of the trial, the DA's office folded their cards and announced that they were dismissing the case.
Well, our interview guest today in this section of the series needs no introduction since it's me. So I'm going to be doing double duty here as a podcast co-host and interview guest.
Yeah, we really felt it was important to hear from you directly, Mehul, as DNA was a major factor in the eventual dismissal of Jane's case. You know, I'll do my best to question you on all the technical stuff, and we won't try to get too deep into the weeds.
Well, I think you'll do fine, Dion. You've learned a lot, and there is a lot to cover here. So this is obviously condensed, but, go easy on me, Dion.
I'll do my best. And just a quick FYI, if you want to hear more about my co-host's background, a good source would be our very first full-length episode, Descent into the Dark Side. With that said, Mehul, let's break down your role in the Jane Dorotik case.
Let's go for it.
So, Mehul, let's jump in. Tell me, had you heard of the Jane Dorotik case before working on it?
You know, I actually hadn't. Maybe I was under a rock, but as soon as I started working on it, you do a little Google, you see that there were TV shows, there was a 48 Hours, there was a Snapped episode about it, there were some others. So apparently it was a high-profile case in its time.
What was the status of the Dorotik case when you first became involved?
Well, so I first became involved in 2017. And at that time, post-conviction testing had been conducted recently, I think at the end of 2016. And Loyola, I'll just call them LPI, they had recently been involved. And I know that during the original post-conviction DNA testing, they were representing Jane, and they were trying to have this testing done at a private lab, but ultimately was done at the San Diego County Sheriff's Department laboratory.
You know what? Just a quick question on that. What's your knowledge of the forensic unit within the San Diego Police Department? Had you any experience with them in the past? They were competent, if they were good?
I hadn't reviewed a lot of work from their lab, so going into it, I didn't really have any preconceived notions about the quality of the work. Obviously, a lot of my reviews in the LA area.
Yeah, I was just wondering because obviously there's some forensic labs out there that have either a great reputation or a bad one. So I was just wondering if you were potentially licking your chops before you got involved. Say, wow, this is in San Diego. This is going to be easy.
Well, yeah, but I did remember that they were somewhat late to the game in becoming accredited. But other than that, I can't say that I had any experience with them either way. Now, I should say, we covered the Stephanie Crow case, right? on
Right.
the podcast. And so San Diego Sheriff was involved in that. In fact, the gentleman who did the blood spatter interpretation on Jane's case also worked on that case. So I guess there, I should say, there was a little bit of a red flag,
Yeah,
at
good
least
point.
about him.
Right. How did you first become involved with the Loyola Project for the Innocent?
Well, in 2017, I was actually attending law school at Loyola. So I heard a lot about the Innocence Project there. And I just reached out to him and said, hey, you've got an asset here right on campus. If you ever need me. Didn't take him long to reach out to me.
and had you done much post-conviction work at that point in your career?
I really hadn't. I just was sort of involved around the edges because, of course, most of my work is pre-conviction,
Right.
Trying to avoid a wrongful conviction. And also in the big scheme of things, post-conviction work is a very small percentage of the cases, of course. So unless you're involved working directly with the Innocence Project
Right.
or a similar chapter, you're not going to be exposed to a lot of post-conviction cases.
So there was no career decision or anything like that. They're just it's a little bit of a rarity.
This is something I wanted to get involved in, the post-conviction
okay.
work. So, the marriage with Loyola, this worked out perfect.
And then what did they ask you to do? They said, hey, they reached out to you and they said, hey, we want to get you involved with the Dorotik case. What was the big ask?
Well, initially they were kind of like, hey, great. We have a DNA person we can talk to because we've got this case that there's DNA evidence all over the place. Back from 2000, 2001, there's new DNA evidence. Help us out with this,
So they were just kind of like, here you go, Mehul.
Kind of. I guess the original ask, if I remember correctly, was, hey, we've got these post-conviction DNA testing results from 2016. At the time, in 2017, they were relatively hot off the press. So I guess the first ask was, what do you think about this? Is there something that could have been done better? Is there anything helpful here? And that kind of led to, hey, why don't, while you're at it, why don't you look at the rest of the case?
Okay. And then, based on that answer, what were your initial impressions?
Well, so the items that were looked at in 2016 were the rope that was found on Bob Dorotik's neck when the body was found, and also his fingernail clippings. So these are things that had not been tested in 2001.
And what was the reason for that? Do you know?
Well, largely the argument was because of technology. So in these types of samples, like the rope, like the fingernail clippings, you were looking for trace DNA, possibly mixed with a large amount of DNA, for example, in the fingernail clippings of Bob's. So the technology at the time wasn't that great at looking at complicated mixtures, detecting low levels of DNA, all that kind of stuff. But obviously by 2016, that's a lifetime from 2001 in DNA technology. So the result was on the rope that they only found DNA that matched Bob Dorotik. So I looked under the hood, looked at all the notes, and I noticed that the way they sampled it, according to the notes, it looks like they just swabbed the very frayed ends of the rope. So, thinking through where might you find DNA from somebody who used this rope to strangle somebody, I don't think they're grabbing just at the very ends, right? They're probably going to be down, 6 inches on the rope trying to get leverage. But another thing, and I'm going to bring up another one of our podcast guests, Jared Bradley. I was just
going to ask you, is this an MVAC application, a potential application?
This is an MVAC application. So it was funny. I brought it up, and then Loyola actually had Jared come down to the law school and give a demonstration very, very early on. I had heard of a case where a rope was MVAC'd and they got results where they didn't before. So that's the rope. Now the fingernail clippings, there were essentially 10 clippings, one from each finger. 8 of them were single source Bob Dorotik. The report said that 2 of the clippings, that there was a mixture, but it was basically inconclusive. So, a good DNA expert doesn't take inconclusive for an answer. You're going to look at it a little bit deeper. And while I agreed that the amount of DNA that was foreign to Bob was very low, it's not like something you could put in CODIS, and figure out whose it is. I started looking at, what could we tell about this? And it was very clear that there were DNA types under those fingernails that could not have come from Bob or Jane Dorotik. So there was, in fact, foreign DNA under the fingernails. This is something that was not mentioned in the report. They just said there's a mixture and we can't do anything with it. So that was a little bit of, I think, of an aha moment for the defense team to say, wait a minute, actually, there was useful information that was gained from the post-conviction testing in 2016.
So part of your initial impression then was there's some openings here.
There's openings. First of all, there was some good information. And second, this could be tested better. Obviously, if you're going to go back to the court, if you have an argument that there's new, better technology, you're going to do a lot better than just, hey, we don't like the way they did it. We want to do it again. So that made it, I think, a little bit easier to sell.
For the judge to accept it. I want to go back. Hey, I want to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole just a little bit. Sometimes if you're there could be in the news factual information that is, I guess, you're reporting it by omission. In other words, you're not being factual. So is there a technique? Have you ever seen this in your career, and specifically with Dorotik's case, where somebody purposely tests an object, for example, the rope, at the ends, where knowing that a lot of the DNA could be more towards the center, but you get away with saying, we tested the rope?
Well, that's exactly how it comes out. So if nobody looked at that, a judge or anyone else would say, well, wait a minute, you had your chance. It was tested. So we've talked about this before. Could that be a lab's reluctance to get anything that's counter to the prosecution? Maybe, I don't know. That could be a conspiracy. Or could it just be there's degrees of care in DNA testing, right? It might all be somewhat the same once it's in a test tube, but how you examine that evidence, how good are you looking for something? I mean, I have cases post-conviction that we go back and look at it where the original analyst said there was no blood, and then you find blood. So how good is somebody looking? Now, what is their motivation for maybe not doing a thorough job? I can't say. I can't get in someone's head.
Well, I was also getting into maybe the judge a little bit, because you're obviously brought onto a lot of cases with attorneys that their knowledge of DNA is obviously not yours. That's why you're brought on, right? Okay, well, couldn't that be that same concept be applied to the judge? If he's not well versed in this, and he hears that the DNA tested the rope, but you as a specialist say, well, where did you test on the rope? So in other words, they're kind of gaming it a little bit, potentially gaming it a little bit by saying, yeah, judge, we tested the rope. And the judge is going, well, hey, defense, they said they tested the rope. We should move on. And then you come on board and say, hey, you need to, what part of the rope did you test?
Yeah. And this goes a little bit to discovery, like just looking at the 2 or 3 page report doesn't tell you the whole story. Doesn't tell you how the rope was sampled, how well you looked. But also, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but at the point that I reviewed the post-conviction DNA testing, I had the recommendations I just mentioned, and I looked at the shortcomings of the original DNA and just the trial, and the testimony and all that. What I had to do is not just, give a one sentence to the judge about, hey, you should test it. I wrote a declaration, and that declaration was 35 pages long, and it spelled out precisely what was the meat behind my opinion.
So you're giving a little bit of a tutorial to the judge of, hey, this is why we're going to do it.
Exactly, because they have to learn this as well to make an informed decision. Or I think you're right. They're just going to go with what the report says. And exactly that. Well, you had your chance. Too bad. So there has to be some education if you want to get that end result. So ultimately, after I gave my input, 2 things happened. Loyola filed a petition for habeas corpus, which is basically, this is all the reasons why we think this conviction's no good. And at the same time, they filed a motion for post-conviction DNA testing, which included the rope, but it also included some other items like Bob's clothing.
Is that a hard get? A post like that request? Yes. Is that hard to get?
It is rare to file a habeas. And in this case, there were several prongs about what was wrong with Jane's case. And, the judge looked favorably on, I think, all or most of them. And that is rare. because the judge may look at that and say, we're not even going to have a hearing. Get out of here with that crap. So he took notice to the petition, and obviously he ultimately approved our motion for post-conviction DNA testing. And I was actually in the courtroom when he approved it, and he was very much like, let's get all of the biological information we can. You guys can fight it out as to what it means later, but why not get as much information as we can, particularly if we've got these new tools?
Gotcha. And then what was the next step after all of that review?
Well, okay, so now I have to talk a little bit about the original trial and the original work. So there was DNA testing done in 2000, 2001. San Diego Sheriff was at the time using what is now an archaic type of DNA testing. It was
described. Just like give me an example of archaic.
Yeah. So, well, what was in vogue in 2000, but they were only looking at, a few genetic loci. It wasn't particularly sensitive, meaning you needed a lot of DNA. It wasn't all that discriminating. In other words, you were getting numbers like 1 in a couple 100,000. You weren't getting the 1 in a septillion,
right?
That kind of stuff. So, and as a matter of fact, there were additional samples that the prosecution wanted tested before the original trial. They sent it out to a private lab who had sort of the next evolution of STR testing that was a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more discriminating.
And then what was your involvement with the new post-conviction testing?
Well, I guess I got to fill you in here a little bit about some of the other problems with the original testing, because this is important. So when I was writing that 35-page declaration, I looked back at the previous DNA work, court transcripts, police reports, the whole enchilada. So I just want to read to you the prosecutor's opening statement in the original trial. Now, the evidence will show that all this blood that has been described to you, the observations made in this bedroom, that it was all sent out for DNA analysis, and it all came back to Bob Dorotik's blood. Okay, so we've had a little bit of background, the idea that crime scene unit goes into the Dorotik's bedroom, they see some blood. Okay. So then this is collected. There's 20 areas, what they call them observations. So different areas around the bedroom where they said, hey, here's something that looks like blood. So prosecutor goes in and says, well, listen, we collected all that blood and we tested it, and it all comes back to Bob. Problem was, and this was very obvious to me once I read the documents, only about half of the samples that were collected actually went to DNA testing. What's worse is that some of the samples didn't go beyond a presumptive test for blood, so they were never determined to actually be blood.
Be blood, right.
So that is demonstrably false evidence that was presented in the trial. Now, here is the most egregious example. In one of these observations, it was a brick wall, and according to the lackluster documentation, there were several stains. There was a sample collected from that group, and at the scene, it was presumptive positive for blood. I should explain what that means. So a presumptive test just tells you, hey, this could be blood. It should be tested further. But a presumptive test doesn't tell you species. So it could be blood from an animal, could be blood from a dog. And it also, there could be false positives. So you cannot say something's human blood based on a presumptive test. So one of these, right? So he samples it at the presumptive positive. They bring it to the lab where they run I would call it a better presumptive test, and it's negative. So, and remember, that's only one stain from a group of stains on the wall, which is right next to another observation of stains. So, that's pretty bad. You're basing a blood spatter interpretation, right, on things that may not be blood. So there were some pretty obvious problems, I think, in the first trial. Another thing I want to talk about, we've heard about the syringe, right? And so, again, I'm going to read from the prosecutor's opening statements. This is the original trial. Now, the syringe, the most telling piece of evidence that connects Jane Dorotik to the murder of her husband. That syringe had a bloody print on it. That print came back to Jane Dorotik. There's only one way that could have happened: when she had her husband's blood in her hands. She picked up the syringe. So they're saying that this is the most important piece of evidence. Now, first of all, there was never any evidence that Bob's body was injected. Kind of the implication here is that, oh, she shot him up with horse tranquilizer. And so that's why the syringe seems to be important. Well, there's no evidence that he was shot up with anything. Second of all, when you look at the actual print and the DNA testing, there's clearly a fingerprint in blood. There's no doubt about it. You can see it. So the fingerprint comes back to Jane. But the DNA testing that was done was not on the ridge area detail of the print. It was on an area on the syringe near the print where there was no fingerprint ridge detail. So the idea was they didn't want to mess up the print by swabbing it for DNA. So ultimately, you've determined that Bob Dorotik's blood, or DNA at least, is on the syringe, but you can't say it came from the ridge detail that was identified to come back from Jane. Some may call it nitpicking, but the evidence is not that her fingerprint is in Bob's blood. It just isn't. The evidence doesn't show that. So this is a way of taking a little bit of a poetic license with the evidence and maybe making it what you want to be. But in a further scientific review, that's not exactly what it is.
I want to go back to, just going back for a second on the syringe, because obviously the prosecution was trying to say this is an aha moment with the syringe that she juiced him up. Did the toxicology reports confirm that? Did he? Because obviously, if she shot him up with a horse tranquilizer, that should be everywhere in the system. Right?
Yeah, there was no finding, and on top of that, there was no evidence that he'd been injected. Like in terms of the medical examiner looking at the body.
Okay, so
that goes away, and so those were two of the, I guess, major beefs I had. There are more. Let me just hit a few. I mean, we could be here all day, but in the bedroom where there's all this supposed blood, there was a stain in the track of the sliding door. Now, under this master bedroom, there was like a storage room. And so the crime scene investigator said, oh, there's a trail of blood leading from the master bedroom onto the floor, onto the ceiling in the storage room, down the wall, and onto this box. Okay, well, I looked at, so he called that a particular observation number, the storage room. And so one swab was taken, but we don't know where in the storage room it was. So yeah, that came back to Bob's blood, but that doesn't substantiate that there's this trail of blood going from the master bedroom down all the way onto a box in the storage room. You would have to take several samples along that trail to say. But what was maybe even worse is that we don't know where he sampled it from. So there was a lot of that. Ultimately, there were some problems with chain of custody. Like, in fact, in that stain from the storage room, everywhere in the paperwork, it says 2 stains were collected. I'm sorry, 2 swabs, 1 stain swab and 1 control. Well, when it was opened up later in testing, there were 3 swabs in there. So there's an unaccounted swab. So there's a lot of instances like that. And, I'm piling on a little bit here, but I think this is important. Another key supposition in the trial is that Bob's blood was in the bed of that pickup truck. Okay. The implication being that Jane killed him, loaded him into the truck, and dumped him. Well, looking a little bit closer at that supposed blood from the truck, it was never confirmed to be human blood. So again, you had a presumptive test. It was one of these that wasn't visible. They had to use special visualization to even see the stain. And when they did that, there were other stains that they found that they later tested, and they were negative for blood. So I also, in this declaration, the 35-page declaration, I opined that this was not confirmed to be human blood. And obviously that could be damning evidence in the prosecution's narrative if that was human blood. So again, playing a little fast and loose with what you can actually conclude from the scientific testing.
Right. I'm getting a lot of conviction by insinuation, meaning that they were just going for these emotional moments on the jury to say, wow, how can you explain this? And there was this blood trail down the wall, and there's blood in the back of the pickup truck. And it's, like, in other words, painting this picture, this mosaic of like blood was everywhere. I mean, I'm not here to defend Jane or anything,
right.
Or anything else, but this is a working ranch, so, you know what I mean? There's going to be, as guys as that sounds, I get nicked up around my house sometimes just doing silly things. I couldn't imagine, working ranch, dealing with horses, there's going to be nicks and cuts.
Well, you make a good point. But on top of that, defense showed evidence that Bob recently had a bloody nose and that he'd cleaned it up in that bedroom. On top of that, there was evidence that they had 2 dogs that were bleeding. So you cannot look at a red stain and say that must be human blood.
Right.
You don't have a DNA analyzer in your eyeball yet. Maybe Elon Musk is getting there. We'll have that soon. But there's a lot of that. Like, I looked at it and therefore it must be Bob Dorotik's blood. So let's just talk about confirmation bias in general. Well, who's going to be the first suspect if the husband's dead? Who are they going to look at? Right. So now maybe you start piling on some stuff. Oh, there's some blood in the bedroom. Do you start getting blinders on? You may well do that. You may well look at evidence a certain way. You may filter out other evidence. Ultimately, that was the role of Loyola in investigating. So while we're doing this DNA stuff, they're doing all this other investigation that was never done in the first place. So we have to look at the performance of the original defense team here. It was bad. They didn't even hire a DNA expert. They stipulated to a lot of the DNA evidence because you've got competing theories, right? Prosecution says, oh, there's some blood in the bedroom. Therefore, that's where Bob was killed.
Right.
And ultimately, in the original trial, they just punted on the DNA. They stipulated to it and said, yeah. And then they came up with this crazy explanation. Well, it wasn't Jane, but it was actually her daughter, Claire. They threw that crazy Ivan in there. But if you do some investigation, because the other theory would be Bob is out jogging and that's when he was killed.
Right.
So, how well was scenario B investigated? And that's really the job of LPI then, to fill in the gaps that unfortunately were never investigated.
Okay, so now in this stage, the new DNA testing was complete. What happens next?
Okay, so new DNA testing. Number 1, we've got a new interpretation of the fingernails. Number 2, we MVAC the rope, and we do find some foreign DNA in addition to Bob's DNA. Now, it's very minimal. You can't put it in CODIS, but it was types that could not have come from Jane. Okay, so that's helpful information. We've moved the ball a little bit more forward than the original testing, right? We've done the MVAC. We sampled, 8 or 10 inches down. In the end, we were more thorough. And then also, we took a look at some of Bob's clothing and we did the MVAC because we weren't looking for bloodstains. We were looking for any, if there was a confrontation, did somebody leave DNA behind on the jacket or on the socks or all of this? And I will say that an MVAC can cut both ways for a criminal defendant. Because if that person's DNA is there, that MVAC's going to find it.
Right.
So it probably says something to a criminal defendant who's willing to say, yeah, take Jared's gizmo, suck up all the DNA you can. So ultimately, the findings were that on Bob's sweat jacket, which was the first piece of evidence that was found before his body was found, Jane is excluded. There are mixtures of DNA. She's not there. On the cuff of that jacket, there was a partial profile that if you assumed it was from a single contributor, Jane is out and possibly could actually be compared to somebody. So you've got absence of Jane's DNA on the socks, on his jacket, and then you've got a new twist, I guess, on the fingernails. So that's kind of where the state of the new evidence was. So now at this point, what do you do? I think that was your next question. Okay, so now there has to be a hearing on whether or not Jane's conviction should be overturned, right? So all this DNA has to be presented. Yeah, the judge has seen the report, but again, the prosecution is going to want to cross-examine them and all of this kind of stuff. So we're prepping for this hearing, and I'm going to testify. Obviously, I'm kind of key in this. So I can remember, working with Paula a few days before, even the night before, all of a sudden we get all of these emails from the prosecutor, and it's all of these QC, quality control problems with individuals in the laboratory. It's like a big data dump right before the hearing. I think the night before. Day of the hearing comes. Prosecutor stands up and says, you know what? We agree that the conviction should be overturned. And there was some, I just want to read from you what the DA said. So the district attorney's office said newly discovered DNA evidence developed from advanced technology unavailable at the time of the 2001 jury trial led the DA's office to concede Dorotik's petition, thus reversing the conviction. There was also a statement, I don't know if I have it handy here, but the prosecutor flat out said, we received new information about some problems with the laboratory techniques and the analysts. So that was a part of it as well. Now, of course, the prosecution can retry Jane if they want to. So I'll turn it back to you.
So do you think there was a little bit of CYA? I mean, what was the motivation behind that dump and that admission?
Well,
which leads to my next question while you ponder that. And that is, why do you think the DA's office wanted to pursue the case after conceding the conviction should be overturned?
Well, a couple of things.
I think it's ego. That's my 2 cents.
Well, if a defense team doesn't ask for something, you're not going to get it. With regards to these problems with the DNA laboratory. Now, is the timing suspicious?
Wait, but did you guys actually ask for it?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. I thought maybe that your 35-page, I guess, review of the case kind of scared them straight a little bit.
Well, okay. So, I mean, 2 things. If you get the dirty laundry in the lab sort of the night before the hearing, is that sandbagging? There was a lot going on here. I mean, at one time, I think the prosecution, they lost their case file. The whole thing's a mess. But number 2, what they wanted to do after the conviction was reversed is they wanted to try to fix some of the things that I mentioned in my declaration. In other words, things that had never been tested, that part they could fix, right? You could just go back and retest it. But you can't really fix the problems with the experts, the chain of custody, the lack of documentation, all of that kind of stuff.
Okay, so and then I don't know if you got that in there. Why do you think they can? Okay, so you're thinking that they decided to pursue after conceding is to try to fill in some of these potholes in their
I mean that was sort of the official statement too. Let's see if I have it here. I don't, but basically they said, hey, listen, we would like to go back and test some of this stuff with new technology and just see where it leads us.
Okay. I want to, kind of mention something on the MVAC. That was an interesting point you made about, if a defendant says, hey, go MVAC all of this.
Right.
It's almost like a forensic lie detector test. Like, if your guy comes in there and says, or your defendant comes in there and says, hey, go for it, they must feel pretty confident that their DNA is not there if they understand what the MVAC can do.
No, I think you're 100% right. Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head. If they understand that, then, that could be a gamble ultimately. So that may tell you something about a defendant and their belief and their innocence, maybe.
Okay, and then you touched on a little bit of these, but give me a couple examples of what's new in DNA testing and forensics in the 16 years between the original hearing and then the follow-up hearing, the retrial.
Oh boy, a lot. I mean,
a couple of like just really
well, first of all, it's faster, so you can do more samples. There's more automation. The testing is more sensitive, so you need less DNA to get a result.
That's probably one of the bigger things, right?
That's really one of the bigger things. But more importantly, so there's the testing in the lab, but the sampling is improved because of the MVAC. So you can get more DNA in the first place to try to analyze. Now, I should say a lot of the samples that they went back and tested from the bedroom and around, they didn't need advanced testing. They could have done that, in 2001. I mean, if you have a lot of blood or, I shouldn't say a lot of blood. If you don't need much blood to get a DNA result because blood is very rich in DNA.
Right. And then what was the new DNA testing the DA's office initiated?
Well, like I say, basically to fill in a lot of those holes. But at the same time, I was present during the DNA testing, and there were some things that.
Real quickly, where did that take place at?
This was another private lab in Northern California.
Okay.
So I was there to observe, but then also I was able to weigh in on, are there some stains that, we wanted to have a look at. So here's an example. There was a pillow sham on the bed in the master bedroom. And in looking at it, there were several stains that looked like blood. Some were positive, but some were negative. And so, that kind of goes into the interpretation of, well, how much blood is actually in that room? Obviously a lot of things look like blood, et cetera, et cetera. And then also there were a few things that were on the bedside table that had not been tested previously, like stains on a lamp, stains on picture, that they either tested negative altogether for blood or human blood was not detected. There was one stain that was on a ottoman that basically it tested positive presumptive for blood, but it wasn't confirmed to be human blood. And there was strong belief based on photographic evidence that that was an example of dog blood. So that kind of showed that there was, as you pointed out, other sources of blood in that house and in the master bedroom.
And then let's move on to the preliminary hearing. Why did that take so long?
Well, two reasons. One is at this point, Loyola had done an exhaustive investigation and they had called the prosecution to task. And presumably the prosecution did some more investigation to try to fill some of the holes. So this was like a battle royale. There's a lot of forensic testimony, whereas none of that was really challenged in the original trial. Now we were going to pick at every little problem.
Right.
Number two, and I don't know if this is out there, but on two occasions, defense attorneys from Loyola had injuries that kept them sidelined for several weeks. So it was a combination of the two.
And then some part of this trial took place during COVID, didn't it?
Well, that didn't help either. So my role, I ultimately did not testify at the preliminary hearing, but I listened to the testimony of several of the experts, and I just did that through the web because of COVID. They're trying to keep down the number of people in the courtroom. And then I helped the attorneys, question those witnesses.
Great segue. And then what was your role in the preliminary hearing?
Yeah, so I pretty much said, so basically help the attorneys in their questioning of the witnesses, listening to the responses, and then giving them feedback about, based on what they answered, what to ask them next, or that kind of thing. So I was available to testify, but the decision was made not to have me testify. Now, I think Aleda explained a preliminary hearing a little bit, but essentially the bar is low to hold somebody over for trial. So very often in criminal cases, these are, a couple hours, one day, something like that, and the DNA evidence may not even come in.
And then what was the outcome of the preliminary hearing?
I would say that there were a lot of bombshells, actually. For example, the blood spatter person, he fell apart in the stand under cross-examination to the point where the prosecutors basically said, we're only going to have this guy testify to limited scope and not expertise.
All right, let me stop you there. You dropped a little bit of a bomb there because you don't hear these, because that's a Perry Mason moment. Hopefully a lot of people will get that reference. What does falling apart look like? Here's trial strategy. That should not have been a Perry Mason moment, because the prosecution was put on warning months and months before about all the deficiencies in the work. They had to know that this guy was going to get crushed on the stand. And what's interesting is, and I think this is during prelim, if not, it was shortly after, the prosecutor said, oh, we got problems with this guy. Let's hire somebody else to look at his work. Well, guess what they said? This guy, this isn't right. He didn't follow all the procedures. I want to go back real quick to that 35-page declaration I wrote. I hit on a lot of things, but one of them is you look at pictures of this guy at the crime scene. He's not wearing gloves. And this is in 2000. Oh, and man. The funniest picture I saw, well, not funny, most pathetic picture, is he's holding up a picture of the carpet that's wet and supposedly has blood. He doesn't have gloves. There's a guy standing right next to him with gloves. So obviously he knew better. So, there's that as well. That's a good point, because your 35-page declaration, you were telegraphing all your punches. They knew what was coming. There should be no surprise.
And not just that, Loyola's, oh my gosh, their habeas petition was like 500 pages long. I mean, this thing was exhausted.
Did you watch when he was on the stand? Were you there? When the San Diego forensic person was on the stand, were you there? Were you watching it?
Not the crime scene guy. No, I was not. Okay. Listening. I had so many other DNA experts to listen to.
And then what was the timeline? Where were we in the timeline of the case at this point?
Yeah. So once the preliminary hearing is over, we're now in early 2022. So Loyola, at the end of all that, with all the stuff that came out, they, of course, filed a motion to dismiss, but that was not granted. So at that point, it's like, okay, we're going to trial. Now, originally, I thought the trial would be end of the year, but all of a sudden they're like, no, the judge is like, we're going to go to trial like in 2 weeks. So, well, it ain't over till it's over, Dion. So
was that normal though? That turnaround of a 2-week turnaround, is that normal?
No, that was surprisingly fast. But on the other hand, look how much litigation and work had been done already in the prelim. It was essentially a mini trial. Point. So in some regard, maybe it was better for the judge and maybe the attorneys just to get right to it before the stuff was not fresh in their mind. All right. So things look bad, right? Jane's got to go to trial again. Although you'd question why, right? All these bad facts came out. It's like, well, why would you take this to a jury? Well, before a trial, there's also pretrial motions. And a few of them had to do with what evidence will come in. And there were issues, not just with the crime scene guy, and ultimately there were rulings that were very favorable and limited that testimony tremendously. But also we heard about the tire tracks a little bit earlier, and there was a ruling that kind of crushed that. So at this point, going into trial, the prosecutor was severely weakened as to what evidence they could put on, thanks in part to the good work of the defense team. So it's at that point they finally said, on the eve of trial, by the way, again, last minute thing, hey, you know what? Case dismissed.
And then why do you think that the charges were ultimately dropped?
I think it took those 2 pretrial rulings to really put it in their face that you're not going to have this evidence. On top of that, you already know what the attack is going to be on the other evidence. So that was just too much I mean, like I say, some would say they could have made that decision earlier, but that is what it was. And ultimately they realized there's no way they can put on a case to convict her here.
You know, to wrap up, let's Monday morning. Well, I'll ask you to Monday morning quarterback yourself. What lessons did you learn from this case? And is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, I think that number one is make sure you get a good defense attorney if you're in trouble. Serious, because this is what I see in post-conviction testings very often is that there was just not good representation in the first place. There wasn't investigation. There was punting on evidence. So that's number one.
That seems to be a reoccurring theme.
It does.
You see all these cases that are, it's sad. We've had, obviously Fernando on, who was, and then we've other cases that are in the news, and you see this over and over and over again, that the original defense team, I hate to say it, but they just dropped the ball or weren't really engaged.
Oh, big time. This is part of the reason I do what I do, because I get attorneys that come to me all the time. They're like, help with square one, help me understand what this even means, much less how we're going to defend it. Other lessons here are, this was a great expose on forensic science in general. So, we had issues with what the DNA meant and how it was sampled and all that. But you think about it, there's other forensic disciplines that are certainly less rigorous than DNA. In other words, there's not as much science behind them. So we had the tire tracks, we had a lot of, well, it's my opinion based on this, but not considering everything. We had the blood spatter, and we had some very bad techniques and archaic methods that I guess worked in 2000, convinced people. But now that we have a greater awareness in forensic science, defense community is not going to stand for that. So also, as a forensic practitioner, you got to remember that everything you do may be questioned in a court of law. So there were a lot of gaps in the chain of custody here. There was, at the original crime scene, the evidence was collected, brought back to the lab, but it wasn't booked for 2 weeks. That looks bad, right? I mean, because there's not really a strict chain of custody until you've booked that evidence. There was, poor documentation, like all of these stains in the master bedroom. Well, we didn't know which particular stain was sampled. A lot of them weren't photographed. There wasn't detail. I talked about the number of swabs being incorrect. All of these things, need to be tightened up, because you never want to be in the position of having to explain what that might be. And being on stand in a murder trial, it's like, I guess it was a clerical error. That's not good enough when you're trying to put somebody away for life.
And then, kind of back to you, how would you like kind of a lesson learned for you personally, or
You've got to have perseverance. You've got to dig. You've got to uncover every rock you can. You touched on this earlier, but you've got to educate the court. If you go in there and write a document
that's another reoccurring theme for you as well.
It is. If you just write a DNA treatise that nobody can understand, judges say, I don't get it. You know, and they may, you got to figure that there may be some preference given to the law enforcement laboratory to start with. We've talked about this before. Yeah. Oh, is this a hired gun? Blah, blah, blah. So I got to come in there. I got to have the goods, I can't come in with wild ass opinions.
Right.
I got to not only have the backup, but be able to explain them. So that was, again, part of the reason. That wasn't the only declaration I wrote. I wrote quite a few of them. There's just other little gaps, like, the talking about the reference blood that was taken from Bob Dorotik. Again, that was something that wasn't booked for 2 weeks. And then you talk about the bedroom. You got to remember that before the crime scene unit came in there and started taking samples, people were in and out of that bedroom for days, because at first Bob was really a missing person. So Jane let, family in, she let cops in.
That's another good point.
And nobody saw it. So again, I'm not alleging planning here, but at the same time, if you don't book Bob's blood vial, if it's not booked at the time you're doing the crime scene investigation, you're going to get all sorts of questions. On top of that, at one point in the post-conviction investigation, the DA investigator said that, Bob's blood vial is completely full of blood. And he shot a video and stuff, and we looked at it and we're like, I don't know if that's true. So I actually went and physically looked at the blood vial, and if you stand it up on its end, you could see that it was half full. So, I mean, you have to be precise in what you're writing down, in what you're saying, and how it's presented in court. I mean, this is really, I don't know, an example of everything that could go wrong and what the stakes are.
Before we end, I want to give you one last little thing here. It seems like that not only is your expertise and scientific knowledge extremely important, it's also being able to translate that, and essentially for the layman who are not as versed as you are, i.e. the judge or other participants. That seems to be really, really key, because if you're giving all this technical scientific information and it's over their head, they, frankly, may not even want to look stupid and just blow right by what you're saying if they're not, absorbing what you're writing down. Is that correct?
There's the science, and it is what it is, and data, but I guess there's an art to this. Not really
absolutely,
an art, but how you then explain it, and remembering, and this is, as a forensic science teacher, remember, this is all done essentially for the benefit of the jury and the court.
Right.
So if there are common sense things that you didn't write this down, or you wrote down the wrong number of swabs, how is a jury, what are they going to think when they hear that? They're going to have they're going to have questions. And so, this is a very intimidating case, because there's all kinds of forensic science, all kinds of experts. Luckily Jane was availed of LPI to help her do this. So yeah, I mean, a lot of lessons. I think you're going to see a lot of presentations on this case. You're going to see a lot. I know Definitely. There's been a lot of TV shows filmed and all of that kind of stuff. So there you have it.
Great interview.
Well, thank you. Wonderful questions. Well, I hope that interview gave everybody at least an overview of some of the issues with the forensic DNA evidence in this case, the testing, the sampling, the documentation, the chain of custody. I mean, Dion, as you can see, what was an apparent mountain of evidence can be reduced to rubble pretty quickly after it's looked at with a critical eye.
Yeah. First of all, I don't think the DA saw you coming at all, because you really brought a sledgehammer to their DNA.
A jackhammer, I would say.
A jackhammer, that's right, to their case. And that was pretty quick. And I also think it was really smart for LPI to give you a call, because I think that's when the dynamics of this case really changed. And having said that, we would need probably several episodes just with you alone to go over all of the twists and turns of the DNA, because all the forensic evidence, because it literally goes from Jane's bedroom all the way out to the crime scene where they found his body. And there was a trail just, but how long it was, at 7 miles long from the house to where they found him at, that you'd have to go over. So it would be there's a lot here. It was really overwhelming.
Yeah, it's hard to condense it. Even just if you just keep it to the DNA and that kind of thing. I mean, I did an interview not long after the dismissal, and I mean, I talked to them for like 2.5 hours, and I think we could have went all day. But this was definitely a very rewarding experience to work side by side with LPI and have a chance to really thoroughly vet a case and just expose all of the possible issues and look at them, kind of under a microscope, so to say. But what's scary, Dion, is that, I mean, how many cases, well, most cases don't have the benefit of being looked at this closely.
Yeah, I did what probably a lot of people do in these situations. You kind of put yourself in the defendant's case of how you would handle it. And I will just say this: if you don't have a good team behind you, especially if there's going to be forensic evidence, someone like you involved, I mean, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, some people, some defense attorneys, they panic when they see DNA evidence. And I think that's what we saw in the first trial here. And, we talked about confirmation bias, like prosecutor. Oh, okay, the first suspect is the spouse. And then you see some evidence, you start maybe getting tunnel vision. But it could be the same on the defense. If they see a bunch of DNA, they might be thinking, okay, we just have to accept it as what it is. And then maybe the investigation isn't as strong. So, that really works both ways. So I enjoy giving input on these cases, and I really treasure the opportunity to be involved in, trying to right some of the wrongs of the justice system.
Yeah, that was disappointing to hear her experience with the first case, but it just didn't seem like they could be bothered with doing any kind of a deep dive into investigating the forensics of this. And it just seemed like they almost convinced themselves of what the narrative is, and then they just ran with that.
Right. I mean, I guess partly a sign of the times in that I think forensic science, I think the defense community has been opening up their eyes a little bit to not just take the lab's word for it and kind of peel back those layers.
That's a good point.
And really scrutinize it. So that's an excellent trend for sure in the justice system.
Well, thanks, Mehul, for being on the hot seat today.
It's pretty painless.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. We hope all of our listeners are enjoying this series on the Jane Dorotik case. And we just want to, once again, we always want to thank our audience out there. We appreciate all your downloads, your listens, your likes, etc. And they're truly appreciated. So if you want to check out all of our episodes, you can do that at Crime Redefined. And we can't wait to bring you the next installment in this series.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.